What is happening, guys? Nick Boletto here, back with another video. In today's video, we are diving back into the foundations of strength training. Today, we are covering principle number 2, which is progressive overload, of course. Let's get into the video, guys. First things first, let's try to define progressive overload as easily and simply as we can. Essentially, progressive overload implies that training needs to 1, be hard, and 2, get harder with time. So you need to train hard, and then you need to, over time, make that training harder and harder. And there are so many ways to accomplish this, guys. A lot of people try to lump it into just one way to progressively overload muscles and movements. However, today I'm going to be covering a bunch of different types of progressive overload. If we refer back to my last video where we talked about specificity, going back to the Bulgarian weightlifting team, so that program that they were running with multiple 1-rep maxes per day is extremely difficult at first, and it took the body a couple months to get used to. And during that time, they did put a lot of weight onto their squats. However, you saw that over time, it was no longer overloading. It was no longer an overloading stimulus, and so they stopped getting stronger. So while the training was challenging, it did not get progressively more and more challenging, which is the progressive aspect of the overload. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to teach you guys how to achieve progressive overload in your training. The number one way that people like to talk about achieving progressive overload, and there's good reason for it, it is the most easy way, I would say, to achieve progressive overload. It's also the one that makes the most sense to us, is to achieve more volume in the gym. And volume is just calculated by reps times sets times weight. So essentially you can increase the amount of reps that you do in a given set with a given weight. You can increase the number of sets while keeping the reps and the weight the same, or you can keep the reps and the sets the same, but you can increase the weight, and all of those ways will increase the total amount of volume that you do. So a quick practical application of this, let's say that we're talking about bicep curls. Week 1, you might do 3 sets of 8 with 30 pounds. Week 2, you might do 4 sets of 8 with 30 pounds. Week 3, you might do 4 sets of 10 with 30 pounds. In week 5, you might go back down to 3 sets of 8, but you might go up to 35 pounds. And over time, over the course of maybe 6 or 8 weeks, maybe you go from 3 sets of 8 with 30 pounds to 4 sets of 10 with 35 pounds. And I am telling you right now that that is a perfect amount of stimulus to grow your arms and also just get stronger biceps as well. Solution number 2 to trying to achieve progressive overload is to increase time under tension. And the best way to do that is with paying attention to tempos while you're lifting. If you are doing 10 reps with 135 on the bench press and you're just kind of lowering the weight and raising it as fast as you can, that set might only take you 10 to 15 seconds. However, if you consciously think about having a 3 or a 4 second eccentric, that set might take you 40 to 45 seconds. And we know that time under tension is going to build muscle and build strength because time under tension makes us better at anything. If we think about other skills outside of the weight room that we have, we know that the more time that we put into those things, the better we get at them, generally speaking. That, of course, implies that we have a certain amount of skill and that we're not practicing the skill incorrectly, because we do know that practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. So assuming that you have the requisite amount of skill to be performing a movement correctly, just doing that movement for longer amounts of time is going to build more muscle, or the muscles that movement trains, and it's going to make you stronger at those movements. So time under tension is a great way to achieve progressive overload. An applicable way to use time under tension to achieve progressive overload is to use timed sets instead of reps and sets. So maybe in week 1, you start with 30 seconds with 30-pound dumbbells for bicep curls. And you just do as many reps as you can. You have a tempo in mind, maybe 3 seconds lowering, and that might come out to be 7 or 8 reps. Then in week 2, you bump it up 5 or 10 seconds, so 35 to 40 seconds. And then each week you add a subsequent 5 to 10 seconds to your sets. And before you know it, you're doing 30-pound dumbbell curls for a whole minute straight. Once you get up to a minute, maybe you go back down to 30 seconds and then bump the weight up. That would be a great way to progressively overload. Another way that you could achieve progressive overload with time under tension is maybe in cycle 1, you're increasing the reps and sets each week, but you're keeping the weight the same, and you're keeping maybe only like a 1-second tempo on the way down. And then in cycle 2, you're using the same weights, the same reps and sets, except that you increase the eccentric time to 2 seconds. And then in cycle 3, you increase to 3-second eccentric, so on and so forth. The third way to achieve progressive overload is increasing the density, and density is just work divided by time. So there are 2 ways to do that. Obviously, you can increase the amount of work in the same amount of time, or you can do the same amount of work in less time. If you take a workout that is 20 sets, and in week 1 you do it in 60 minutes, week 2 55 minutes, week 3 50 minutes, and so on and so forth, that's increasing the density, and that is going to achieve progressive overload. On the flip side, you could also tell yourself that you're going to work out for an hour and that's it, and each week you try to do more sets. So maybe in the first week you do 16 sets in an hour, and then in week 2 you do 19 sets, and then in week 3 you do 22 sets in an hour, and so on and so forth. Obviously, both ways are going to be decreasing our rest times. The most applicable way to increase the density of your workouts is to decrease your rest time over time. So maybe in week 1 you rest 90 seconds, and then in week 2 you go down to 75 seconds, week 3 60 seconds, so on and so forth. And by decreasing your rest time, you will of course decrease the amount of time that you're working out in general. And we already said that decreasing the amount of time is going to increase the density, which will produce progressive overload. There is a 4th way to achieve progressive overload, and I would say that this method should really be safe for higher, intermediate, and advanced lifters, and that is to increase the amount of effective reps over time. In this case, I'm defining effective reps as reps that are closer to failure. So I would say repetitions that are done at least in RPE 7 up to an RPE 10. Beginning lifters and intermediate lifters need to more so focus on the tempo and the density and the amount of volume they're doing, and they don't need to necessarily go close to failure very often. However, higher intermediates and advanced trainees need to train closer and closer to failure more and more often over time in order to induce the maximal stimulus to cause hypertrophy and strength gains. An applicable way to do this is in week 1, have all of your exercises being taken to an RPE 7. So purposefully leaving 3 reps in reserve. Then in week 2, you might take your isolation exercises to RPE 8. And then in week 3, you might take all exercises to RPE 8, so on and so forth. I like to increase the effective reps on isolation movements first, just because it's a little bit safer to go to failure on those. I like to avoid failure on compound lifts if possible, and I do like to take the isolation lifts to failure every once in a while. So that's it, guys. Those are the 4 different ways to achieve progressive overload. I hope that you guys found this video extremely helpful, extremely informative, and I hope that this video has you looking forward to video number 3 in the Foundations of Strength Training video series. And I, of course, am looking forward to that next video.